The British Empire was not built on fair trade, honest competition, or patient hard work alone, no matter how often school textbooks try to frame it that way. It was built on theft, and not the kind of petty theft you might picture in a crowded marketplace, but industrial-scale robbery carried out under the protection of royal authority. From the 16th century onward, the English state discovered that it could turn piracy into policy. It learned that, instead of producing wealth slowly at home, it could intercept the flow of riches leaving the New World and divert it into English ports. That decision changed England's fate and set the foundations for an empire that would dominate global trade for centuries. If you're into money and investing, subscribe and support this video with a like. Now, let's continue. To see how this began, you have to picture Europe in the late 1500s. Spain and Portugal sat at the top of the international food chain. Their explorers had crossed the Atlantic, planted flags in the Caribbean and the Americas, seized vast territories, and built a transoceanic system of extraction. Spanish galleons sailed from ports like Veracruz, Cartagena, and Portobelo back to Europe, loaded with silver from Potosi in present-day Bolivia, gold from Mexico and Colombia, and cargoes of sugar, tobacco, dyes, spices, and enslaved people. The Spanish crown creamed off a substantial share through taxes like the Quinto Real, the royal fifth, and used that river of treasure to finance religious wars, build splendid palaces and cathedrals, and maintain armies and fleets across Europe. For a time, it really did look as if Spain would be the permanent superpower of the early modern world. England, by contrast, occupied a different place in that hierarchy. It was still a relatively poor peripheral kingdom on the edge of the continent. Its economy was underdeveloped compared to the great trading centers of Spain, Portugal, and the Italian states. English merchants had no great overseas empire, no monopoly routes to Asia or the Americas, and no steady inflow of colonial bullion. Queen Elizabeth of France presided over a realm that was ambitious but cash-strapped. She lacked the tax base and treasure reserves to challenge Spain openly in a conventional naval war. Yet she was locked in a religious and political rivalry with Spain, and could not simply accept Spanish dominance. If England could not outproduce Spain in factories or mines, she would have to find another way to level the playing field. That alternative path was piracy, upgraded and legalized. Under Elizabeth, the English crown began to issue documents known as letters of marque and reprisal. These were, on the surface, legal instruments that authorized private ship captains to attack the vessels of specific enemy nations. In practice, they turned freebooters into contractors of the state. A captain who held such a letter could intercept a Spanish or Portuguese ship, seize its cargo, and bring it back to an English port, all while claiming legal cover. The crown took a share of the loot, investors received a portion, and the crew split the rest according to agreed formulas. What would have been pure piracy became something else in the eyes of the law: privateering, violence wrapped in legitimacy. The distinction between pirate and privateer is largely one of branding. A pirate attacked whoever he pleased and was considered an outlaw by every state. A privateer attacked only those targets specified by his commission and could, theoretically, be treated as a lawful combatant. In reality, many captains switched between roles depending on convenience. Yet, for England, the political advantage was obvious. The crown could strike at Spanish wealth indirectly, without formally declaring war, while maintaining a veneer of deniability. If Spain complained, English officials could shrug and claim that any excessive violence was the fault of overzealous individuals, not official policy. Among the men who thrived in this gray zone, one name stands out above the rest: Francis Drake. Modern schoolbooks often present him as a daring explorer and navigator, the heroic figure who circumnavigated the globe and helped defeat the Spanish Armada. Those achievements are real, but they obscure his main function. Drake was, above all, a professional thief under royal license. His great voyage around the world, launched in 1577, was less a scientific expedition than a long, calculated robbery, aimed squarely at the weakest points of Spain's Pacific Empire. That voyage began with secrecy. Officially, Drake was told to explore and look for new trade opportunities, but the real instructions were delivered in private conversations and coded directives. Elizabeth's court had learned through spies and informants that the Spanish Pacific coast was lightly defended. Treasure from Peru and Chile moved north by sea to Panama, then overland to the Caribbean, where it was loaded onto fleet ships for the crossing to Europe. If someone could slip into that Pacific corridor, they could intercept extraordinary amounts of wealth. Drake and his backers intended to be that someone. The high point of Drake's campaign came in 1579, when he ambushed the galleon Nuestra Señora de la Concepción, nicknamed Cacafuego, off the coast of modern Ecuador or Colombia. The ship was a floating vault. Its holds were stuffed with 26 tons of silver, chests packed with silver coins, gold ingots, jewelry, rich fabrics, and fine goods like porcelain intended for elite customers in Europe. The volume of treasure was so great that it took Drake's men around 6 days to transfer it all to their own vessels. When historians estimate the value in modern terms, they arrive at figures in the tens of millions of dollars or more, not counting the indirect effects once that bullion entered financial circulation in England. Drake limped home in 1580, with only one ship left from his original small fleet, the Golden Hind. But that ship sat so low in the water with plunder that the voyage was a financial triumph. Investors who had funded the expedition enjoyed returns of several $1,000%. Queen Elizabeth herself had secretly taken a stake in the mission, and her share of the profits was large enough to clear much of her government's debt. The symbolism of what happened next is hard to miss. Elizabeth went down to the harbor at Deptford, boarded the Golden Hind, and knighted Drake on its deck. She literally placed the sword of royal authority on the shoulder of a man who had become wealthy by stealing Spanish treasure. In that moment, piracy became patriotism. The pirate became a national hero. Drake's career did not end with Cacafuego. In the mid-1580s, as Anglo-Spanish tensions escalated toward open war, he led further attacks against Spain's Caribbean possessions. In 1585 and 1586, he carried out destructive raids on Santo Domingo and Cartagena, two of the most important cities in the Spanish New World. These were not small-scale ship robberies. Drake's forces landed, overpowered the local defenses, burned warehouses, looted churches and merchant houses, and sometimes held cities to ransom, forcing authorities to pay for his withdrawal. In 1586, he also attacked St. Augustine in Florida, one of the oldest European settlements in what is now the United States, and left it in flames. From Spain's point of view, these acts were terrorism. From England's perspective, they were aggressive but cost-effective strategy. Drake was not the only figure to operate in this space. By the mid-17th century, as England expanded its colonial footprint in the Caribbean, another notorious captain rose to fame, Henry Morgan. Morgan operated from bases in Jamaica and other English-held islands, targeting the heart of Spain's American empire. He built his reputation and fortune, not just through single-ship captures, but through coordinated assaults on entire cities. His most audacious exploit came in 1671, when he led more than 1,200 men in an overland march across the Isthmus of Panama to attack Panama City on the Pacific coast. That march through jungle and swamp was grueling, and Spanish forces tried to block his path, but Morgan's troops eventually battered their way through and reached the city. What followed was a classic early modern sack. Buildings burned, churches were looted, residents were killed, tortured, or taken hostage, and the city's accumulated wealth in gold, silver, precious stones, fine textiles, and enslaved people was stripped and divided among the raiders. The amounts involved were enormous by the standards of the time. Treasure was carted away not in a handful of chests, but in long columns of laden mules and wagons. Officially, Morgan had violated a recent peace treaty between England and Spain. The raid was, on paper, an act of rogue aggression. Yet, when Morgan was arrested and sent back to London, the reaction he received speaks volumes. Rather than being executed or imprisoned, he was questioned, feted in elite circles, and eventually knighted. The English political establishment recognized that he had struck a major blow against a rival power and enriched English interests in the process. Soon afterward, he was sent back to the Caribbean as Lieutenant Governor of Jamaica, one of England's key colonial outposts. A man who had burned a Spanish city to the ground was now part of colonial government. Once again, the message was clear. If you steal effectively in the service of the English crown, you will not only be forgiven, you will be rewarded and folded into the official hierarchy. What made English piracy distinctive in this era was not that it existed, every maritime power had pirates on its fringes, but that it was organized, funded, and integrated with the machinery of the state. These were not solitary outlaws drifting from port to port in worn-out ships. They were, in effect, commissioned entrepreneurs operating under royal charters and backed by investors. Each major expedition required capital to buy or outfit ships, purchase weapons, hire crews, and stock provisions. That capital came from merchants, aristocrats, city guilds, and sometimes from the queen or her ministers themselves. They treated these voyages as high-risk, high-reward ventures, similar to speculative trading trips or early joint stock enterprises. The financial structure of privateering was highly deliberate. Before a voyage, contracts laid out how any plunder would be distributed. The crown claimed a fixed portion, often around a tenth or more, as a kind of royal tax. Investors who had provided ships and supplies were entitled to another share. The captain and officers received enhanced cuts, reflecting their leadership roles and social rank. The remaining booty was then divided among the crew, sometimes according to a detailed point system that took into account position, experience, and prior service. In that sense, privateering looked very much like an early form of profit sharing or equity participation, except that the underlying business model was robbery. For sailors, this system offered a rare path out of grinding poverty. Life at sea was brutal and dangerous, but a successful raid could turn a poor deckhand into a man with enough money to buy land or start a small business. For investors, the risks were substantial. Ships could sink, be captured, or return empty. But the occasional spectacular success made the whole game seem irresistible. For the crown, the benefits were strategic as well as financial. England could weaken Spanish power, gather intelligence about its colonies, and enrich itself, all while avoiding some of the costs and diplomatic consequences of open warfare. If things went badly, the government could claim that a particular captain had exceeded his orders. Over time, this model of predatory finance evolved. As political circumstances changed and open piracy became diplomatically inconvenient, England and later Britain shifted toward more formalized instruments of overseas control. The underlying logic of high-risk, violent extraction, however, did not disappear. It simply moved into new institutional forms, most famously the great chartered companies such as the English East India Company and the Hudson's Bay Company. These corporations were granted royal charters that effectively outsourced significant chunks of foreign policy and expansion to private capital. They received monopolies over trade in certain regions, the right to raise armed forces, negotiate treaties, and administer territory. In other words, the powers once granted to individual privateers were scaled up and handed to corporate entities. Where a captain like Drake had attacked Spanish treasure ships on the high seas, the East India Company used its private army and political leverage to extract wealth from Bengal, Madras, and other regions of India. It imposed taxes, controlled trade, and forced local producers to accept its terms. The tools changed trade compacts and tax systems instead of cannon fire on galleons, but the essential pattern remained. Wealth flowed from conquered or subordinated territories back to London, where it strengthened Britain's financial system, funded further imperial expansion, and enriched the shareholders and politicians who backed the scheme. It is helpful to think of the loot seized by privateers and the revenues extracted later by chartered companies as forms of primitive capital accumulation. The gold and silver taken from Spanish shipping did not sit idle in vaults. It entered English and later British financial networks. Merchants used it to expand their trading operations. The Crown used it to pay off debts, fund navies, and build the administrative apparatus of the state. City financiers used it to underwrite new ventures, from manufacturing businesses to additional overseas expeditions. In this sense, piracy and privateering were not side stories or colorful footnotes. They were part of the engine that propelled England from a second-rate power to a major imperial player. Seen from this angle, the story of English privateering aligns with a broader pattern in the history of empires. Empires rarely grow through peaceful trade alone. They rely on extraction systems that shift resources from weaker regions to the imperial core. Those systems are dressed in different clothing at different times. In one century, the mechanism is the letter of marque. In another, it is the charter of a corporate monopoly. In later eras, it might be unequal trade treaties, debt structures, or control of key financial institutions. The goal is consistent: ensure that the flow of value moves in one direction, from the periphery to the center, while keeping the process wrapped in enough legal and ideological justification that it appears natural or inevitable. When you look at the early modern world through this lens, you also see how power likes to outsource risk. In the 16th century, Elizabeth did not send the royal fleet to openly attack Spanish treasure convoys at first, partly because that would have been diplomatically explosive and financially costly. Instead, she commissioned privateers who used privately financed ships and crews. If those captains died, lost their vessels, or were hanged by the Spanish as pirates, the losses fell mostly on the investors and sailors, not on the crown. If they succeeded, however, a generous share of the loot flowed back to the royal treasury. In our own time, when governments want to wage war or carry out sensitive operations with limited oversight, they often hire private military contractors. The structure is familiar. Outsource the dirtiest work, keep official hands clean, reap the strategic benefits when things go well, and deny responsibility when things go wrong. The same pattern appears in the realm of finance. In the 17th century, letters of marque and joint stock charters created semi-private channels for predation. Today, the equivalents are complex corporate structures, offshore jurisdictions, and lightly regulated investment vehicles. Wealthy individuals and corporations use layers of shell companies and tax havens to shield their assets from taxation and scrutiny. Losses can be offloaded onto taxpayers in crises, while profits are privatized. In both eras, legal instruments are deployed to create a shadow zone where high-risk, high-reward activities can occur without fully exposing elites to the consequences. Modern economic warfare has also inherited the logic of early privateering in subtler ways. Where Drake used cannon fire to blow holes in Spanish hulls, today's states use sanctions, targeted financial restrictions, and cyber attacks to disrupt the economic systems of their rivals. Cutting a nation off from the global payment system, freezing its reserves, or sabotaging its infrastructure may be less visually dramatic than a burning port city, but the goal is similar: weaken an opponent's capacity to project power by attacking the flow of resources that sustains it. Once again, the methods evolve while the underlying strategy remains remarkably consistent. If you zoom out further, a larger and more uncomfortable question appears. If one of history's most celebrated empires was built in part on theft disguised as policy, why would we assume that the systems we live under today are fundamentally different in spirit? British elites did not hesitate to turn pirates into national heroes when their thefts helped pay royal debts and finance expansion. They did not hesitate to grant corporations the right to conquer and tax foreign territories so long as the profits flowed home. Do we really imagine that modern institutions, whether they are governments, banks, or global corporations, will permanently restrain themselves from similar behavior when their survival or dominance is at stake? History suggests that when powerful actors face constraints or crises, they look for tools to move other people's wealth into their own hands with minimal overt violence. Sometimes those tools are obvious, like confiscating gold or seizing cargoes. Sometimes they are more subtle, like inflating away the value of savings, rewriting bankruptcy laws, or imposing emergency measures that allow for the freezing or reallocation of assets. The details differ, but the core principle is stable. When the rules get in the way of power's needs, the rules are changed. The lesson for individuals is not to descend into fatalism, but to recognize the pattern and adjust their understanding of what wealth really means. If your entire sense of security is built on claims that exist inside systems controlled by others, bank balances, pension promises, complex financial products, you are ultimately vulnerable to the decisions of people and institutions you do not control. Real resilience comes from assets, skills, and knowledge that retain value even when formal rules are bent or overturned. That might mean owning certain physical assets outright, building businesses that create real value, or cultivating abilities that allow you to earn a living in many different circumstances. When you connect the story of English privateers to later episodes, the continuity becomes more striking. In the 20th century, the United States made it illegal for citizens to own most forms of gold and compelled them to sell it to the government at a fixed price, only to raise the official gold price later. In the 21st century, repeated cycles of crisis response have involved central banks creating vast amounts of new money, which often has the effect of boosting asset prices, while slowly eroding the purchasing power of ordinary salaries and savings. These policies are justified as necessary for stability, just as Elizabeth's privateering was framed as necessary to check Spanish power. The burden, however, falls disproportionately on those with the least political influence. What the rise of the British Empire shows, in a very clear and almost exaggerated way, is that moral language about hard work, fair play, and free trade has often served as a cloak for more ruthless mechanisms of accumulation. England turned men like Francis Drake and Henry Morgan into symbols of national pride, even though their fame rested on activities that, stripped of legal and patriotic rhetoric, were essentially large-scale armed robbery. The wealth they stole became part of the foundation of a global empire. That empire, in turn, reshaped world trade, politics, and culture, leaving legacies that are still visible today. History keeps repeating its central themes, even if the costumes are updated. When states need money or strategic advantage, they look for pirates, whether those pirates sail wooden ships, run chartered corporations, design complex financial products, or operate behind carefully worded legal documents. The primary constant is that the system itself is always protected first, and the costs of that protection are shifted onto those least able to resist. If this perspective changes how you see empire, finance, and the stories we tell about them, then it is worth staying curious. The more you understand about how power has operated in the past, the better prepared you are to recognize its moves in the present. And if you want to keep exploring the parts of history that rarely make it into textbooks, subscribe, because the patterns we uncover, there may be the only warning you get before the next round of legalized piracy begins.